What would you do if the person you trusted most held the darkest secrets? A loving husband discovers his wife's shocking betrayal, a hidden lover, deceitful plans, and a scandal threatening to destroy their family. When their daughter uncovers a truth even more devastating, the family's world unravels. But how far will one man go to protect what matters most? Stay with us as we reveal the lies, heartbreak, and shocking twists that left everyone asking, "Could this happen to me?" Where are you right now? You don't want to miss this. The morning was unusually bright, with the kind of warmth that hinted at summer's early arrival. David Whitfield, sweat dripping down his brow, balanced on the narrow scaffold, calling out instructions to his crew below. His booming voice carried authority, but there was a weariness behind it, the kind born of long days and an endless grind. "Careful with that beam, Roger," he shouted. "It's not steady yet." The air was filled with the sharp clang of metal and the hum of machinery. The job was on schedule, but David's mind was elsewhere. Sophie had a school play coming up, and Emma had been unusually distant lately. He had asked her about it the night before, but she had waved him off with a tight smile. "You're imagining things," she'd said, her voice clipped. "I've just been tired." Something in her tone had lingered with him, even as he kissed Sophie goodnight and sat alone in the living room, staring at the flicker of the television without really watching. "David, watch out!" The shout snapped him back to the present, but it was too late. A heavy beam swung loose from the crane above, knocking the scaffold's balance off kilter. He felt the jarring lurch beneath his feet, the metal groaning in protest, and then nothing. The world turned sideways. There was a deafening crash as his body hit the ground, followed by the sharp, sickening crack of bone. Pain shot through him, white-hot and unrelenting, and then everything blurred into a haze of shouting voices and panicked footsteps. "Call an ambulance!" someone yelled. David tried to move, but his body betrayed him, pinned under the weight of something he couldn't see. His vision dimmed, and the sounds around him grew muffled, like he was sinking underwater. "Emma," he murmured before darkness claimed him. When he woke, the sterile brightness of a hospital room greeted him. Machines beeped steadily beside him, their rhythmic tones the only sound. His head throbbed, and when he tried to shift, a searing pain shot through his lower back. "David?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. Emma sat beside his bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't looking at him. "You're awake," she said flatly. "Emma." His voice was hoarse. He tried to reach for her hand, but it felt like his arms were made of lead. "What happened?" Her eyes flickered to him for a brief moment before darting away. "You fell, David. The doctors—" She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They said you'll never walk again." The words hit like a punch to the gut. His breath caught and he blinked rapidly, hoping he had misheard. "Never?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress. "I need to check on Sophie. She's been worried sick." "Emma, wait!" His voice cracked, desperation bleeding into his tone. "Stay, please." Her hesitation was barely noticeable, but it was there. She turned, her expression unreadable. "Get some rest, David. You'll need your strength." And then she was gone. The emptiness in the room was suffocating. David stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. His thoughts went to Sophie, her bright smile and boundless energy. How was he supposed to be the father she needed now? What kind of husband could he be when he couldn't even stand? Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, he clenched his fists, the pain in his body a distant echo compared to the ache in his chest. Outside the door, Emma leaned against the wall, her hands trembling. She had heard the raw anguish in David's voice, but she couldn't bring herself to face him fully. The weight of everything, his accident, their financial strain, her growing doubts. It was too much. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. But deep down, she knew the words weren't true. She could do it. She just wasn't sure if she wanted to. The house felt quieter than ever, though the faint hum of Sophie's cartoons played in the background. Emma stood by the sink, staring blankly at the pile of unwashed dishes. Her hands trembled as she reached for a plate, but her grip faltered, and it slipped, shattering against the edge of the counter. "Mom?" Sophie's small voice carried from the living room. Emma shut her eyes, steadying herself. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just dropped something." She crouched to pick up the broken pieces, but her thoughts wandered, unrelenting. David's accident had left her juggling too much: finances, caregiving, and a future that now seemed impossibly heavy. From the bedroom, David's voice called out weakly, "Emma, can you come here?" Her stomach twisted as she wiped her hands on a towel and walked down the hallway. The sight of him in bed, pale and frail, sent a pang through her chest. She plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you need something?" she asked, standing at the doorway. He gestured toward the bedside table. "Water, please." She filled the glass and handed it to him, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was electric, but not in the way it used to be. It was charged with unspoken words and an unbridgeable distance. "Emma," his voice faltered, his eyes searching hers. "Are we going to be okay?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him yes, to reassure him like she had so many times before, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked away, focusing on the worn quilt covering his legs. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. David's hand gripped hers suddenly, his strength surprising her. "Don't give up on me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Her breath caught, and for a moment her composure wavered. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his hand. "I'm trying, David, I really am." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Emma sat on the couch with her laptop, scrolling through bills and medical statements. The numbers blurred together, a tidal wave of debt that threatened to drown her. She buried her face in her hands, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The faint buzz of her phone broke the silence. She wiped her eyes and glanced at the screen. Marcus's name lit up. "Hey," she answered, her voice still thick with emotion. "You sound off," Marcus said, his tone warm and concerned. "Everything okay?" Emma hesitated. She shouldn't be talking to him. David would hate it if he knew. But Marcus had been a friend for so long, and right now she needed someone to talk to. "Just a lot on my plate," she admitted. "I can imagine. It's not fair, Emma. You're carrying this all by yourself." His words struck a chord, and a fresh wave of tears welled up. "I don't know how much more I can take." "You don't have to do it alone," Marcus said softly. "I'm here for you. Always." The sincerity in his voice was like a lifeline, pulling her out of the dark waters for a moment. She closed her eyes, clutching the phone tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. The next morning, Sophie stood in the kitchen, pouring herself a bowl of cereal. David's wheelchair hummed softly as he maneuvered himself into the room. "Morning, pumpkin," he said with a forced cheerfulness. Sophie smiled weakly. "Morning, Dad." She carried her bowl to the table and sat down, watching him struggle to adjust his chair. After a moment, she spoke hesitantly. "Do you think Mom's okay?" David's hands froze on the wheels of his chair. He looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What do you mean, honey?" "She seems sad all the time, and she doesn't smile like she used to." David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Mom's been through a lot. We all have. But she's strong. She'll be okay." Sophie nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. "I hope so," she said quietly. As David watched his daughter, his resolve hardened. He couldn't let his family fall apart. Not like this. Emma parked her car outside the coffee shop, her heart pounding as she checked her phone one last time. Marcus's message was simple. "I'm here, corner table." She hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. The bell above the door jingled as she walked in, and there he was, smiling at her like everything was fine, like her life wasn't crumbling around her. Marcus stood, pulling her chair out with an easy confidence that felt strangely comforting. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice warm and familiar. Emma nodded, glancing around nervously. "It's just coffee," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Of course," Marcus replied, leaning forward. "How are you holding up?" The question unraveled her carefully constructed composure. She looked away, blinking back tears. "I don't know how to answer that," she admitted. "Everything feels broken." Marcus reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You don't have to do this alone, Emma. You deserve better than this." His words were a whisper, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not as a caretaker, not as someone barely holding it together, but as a person. "It's not that simple," she replied, her voice cracking. "David, he's trying, but everything's changed. I've changed." Marcus's eyes softened, and he pulled his hand back, giving her space. "Sometimes change is what we need to find ourselves again," he said. "You've been carrying the weight of the world for so long, Emma. Let someone carry it with you." Her breath hitched, and she looked down at her coffee, the steam curling into the air between them. She hated how much his words resonated, how easy it was to imagine a life where she wasn't drowning in responsibility. As they talked, time slipped away unnoticed. Emma found herself laughing softly at Marcus's jokes, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. But when she checked her watch, reality came crashing back. "I need to go," she said abruptly, standing up and grabbing her bag. Marcus rose too, his expression unreadable. "Emma!" She paused, her hand on the door. "This was just coffee, Marcus. That's all it can ever be." But even as she said the words, doubt flickered in her heart. When she arrived home, the house was quiet. Sophie was at a friend's house, and David was in the bedroom, reading. Emma set her bag down carefully, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the memory of Marcus's voice, his touch, the way he had looked at her. "Emma?" David's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to find him in the doorway, his wheelchair angled awkwardly. "You're home late," he said, his tone light but his eyes questioning. "Traffic," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. David didn't press further, but the silence between them was heavy. As Emma busied herself in the kitchen, David wheeled himself to the living room, his heart sinking. Something was wrong, he could feel it. Later that night, as Emma showered, David noticed her phone on the counter. The screen lit up with a message. "I meant what I said. You deserve better. M." The blood drained from David's face. He picked up the phone, staring at the text, his hands trembling. When Emma came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she froze at the sight of David holding her phone. "Who's M?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with pain. Emma's heart stopped. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. The distance between them, once a crack, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Sophie sat at the dining table, her homework spread out in front of her, but her pencil hovered above the paper untouched. She couldn't focus. Not when everything felt so wrong. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that carried tension in every corner. From her seat, she could see her dad in the living room staring out the window. His wheelchair was angled toward the street, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. Sophie swallowed hard, her chest tightening as she watched him. "Daddy?" Her voice broke the stillness, tentative but clear. David turned his head, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Pumpkin, homework going okay?" She shrugged, setting her pencil down. "It's fine. Are you okay?" David hesitated. He had always been honest with Sophie, but some truths felt too heavy for a 12-year-old to carry. "Just tired," he said finally. Sophie's eyes narrowed, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "You don't seem tired. You seem sad." The words hit David harder than he expected, and he looked away, pretending to adjust the blanket over his legs. "It's been a tough few weeks, that's all. But I'm okay, sweetheart, I promise." She didn't believe him. Sophie wasn't sure when it had started, but she could feel the cracks in their family growing wider. Her mom seemed distracted all the time, and her dad was quieter than usual. They were still kind, still loving, but it felt like they were trying to hold on to something slipping through their fingers. Later that evening, Sophie wandered into the kitchen and found her mom at the counter, scrolling through her phone. Emma's shoulders were tense, her face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. Sophie hesitated before speaking. "Mom?" Emma flinched, quickly locking her phone and slipping it into her pocket. "Sophie, you scared me. What's up?" Sophie frowned, stepping closer. "Are you okay? You and Dad seem different." Emma forced a laugh, ruffling Sophie's hair. "You don't need to worry about grown-up stuff, honey. Everything's fine." But Sophie didn't miss the way her mom avoided eye contact or the slight tremor in her voice. "Are you sure?" she pressed. Emma knelt down to her level, holding her daughter's face in her hands. "Sophie, sometimes life gets complicated. But your dad and I love you more than anything. That's the only thing that matters, okay?" Sophie nodded slowly, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. The next day at school, Sophie sat with her best friend Emily during lunch. She poked at her sandwich, her appetite gone. "What's up with you?" Emily asked, leaning closer. "My parents," Sophie admitted. "Something's wrong, I can feel it." Emily tilted her head. "Like what? Are they fighting?" Sophie shook her head. "Not really, but my mom's been acting weird. She's always on her phone and she's gone a lot. And my dad, he just looks so sad all the time." Emily frowned. "Do you think your mom's seeing someone else?" The words hit Sophie like a punch. She had never considered that possibility, but now it lodged itself in her mind, impossible to ignore. "I don't know," Sophie whispered, "but I'm going to find out." That evening, as Emma and David tucked her into bed, Sophie hugged them both a little tighter than usual. "Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Good night, sweetheart," Emma replied, kissing her forehead. David lingered by the door, watching his daughter settle into bed. "Sweet dreams, Pumpkin," he said, his voice warm despite the heaviness in his heart. As they left the room, Sophie's resolve hardened. She needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. The morning light spilled into the kitchen, glinting off the stainless steel appliances as Emma hurriedly packed Sophie's lunch. Her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. She glanced at her phone on the counter, its screen dark, yet the weight of unread messages felt heavy. "Mom!" Sophie's voice startled her. Emma turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her school bag slung over one shoulder. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice more strained than she intended. Sophie hesitated. "Are you?" Emma froze for a split second before pasting on a smile. "Of course, honey. Why wouldn't I be?" Sophie didn't answer. She walked to the table, her gaze lingering on Emma as if searching for something unspoken. "Let's go. You'll be late," Emma said quickly, grabbing her keys. The car ride was filled with awkward silence. Sophie stared out the window, her fingers drumming against her knee. Emma kept her eyes on the road, but the tension between them was palpable. At the school drop-off, Sophie hesitated before opening the door. "Mom?" Emma sighed, gripping the steering wheel. "What is it, Soph? You can tell me things, you know, even if they're hard." The words caught Emma off guard. She forced a laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. "You're too young to worry about grown-up problems." Sophie frowned, her gaze piercing. "Maybe, but I'm not too young to know when something's wrong." Emma watched as Sophie climbed out of the car and walked toward the school building, her heart aching. That afternoon, David sat at the dining table, sorting through a stack of overdue bills. The numbers blurred together as frustration mounted. He clenched his jaw, the helplessness gnawing at him. "David?" Emma's voice broke the silence. He looked up, surprised to see her home earlier than usual. "What's up?" Emma hesitated, the question throwing her off. "I just thought I'd check in, see if you need anything." David gestured to the bills. "Unless you've got a magic wand to make all this go away, I'm fine." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm trying, David. We're all trying." He pushed the papers aside, his gaze narrowing. "Are we? Because it feels like I'm the only one stuck in this mess while you—" He stopped himself, the accusation hanging in the air. Emma stiffened. "While I what?" David shook his head, his voice dropping. "Forget it." "No," Emma snapped. "Say it. You think I'm not doing enough, is that it?" His eyes met hers, tired and sad. "I think you've already checked out, Emma, and I'm starting to wonder if you ever planned on coming back." Her breath caught, the words cutting deeper than she expected. Before she could respond, Sophie's voice echoed from the hallway. "Stop it!" They both turned to see her standing there, her face red with anger and tears welling in her eyes. "You always fight now!" Sophie shouted, her voice trembling. "Why can't you just talk to each other like you used to?" Emma stepped toward her, but Sophie backed away. "No, I'm sick of it!" David wheeled himself closer, his expression softening. "Sophie, sweetheart. No, Dad. You're both pretending like everything's fine, but it's not." She wiped at her tears furiously. "I'm not stupid. I know something's wrong." Emma sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. The weight of Sophie's words settled heavily between them. David reached out, his voice gentle. "Come here, pumpkin." Sophie hesitated before walking into his arms, her small frame shaking as she sobbed into his chest. "I'm sorry," David whispered, stroking her hair. "We'll figure this out, I promise." Emma watched the scene, her own tears streaming silently down her cheeks. For the first time in weeks, she felt the full weight of what they were doing, not just to each other, but to Sophie. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Emma's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it hesitantly, her heart sinking when she saw Marcus's name. "I miss you. Call me?" Emma stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. In the quiet darkness, the choice loomed large, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what she wanted. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store were harsh, casting unflattering shadows as Emma walked down the aisle. Her mind was clouded, replaying Sophie's outburst from the day before and the growing tension with David. She picked up a carton of milk absent-mindedly, barely noticing the two women at the end of the aisle whispering as they glanced in her direction. "Is that her?" one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. Emma froze, her hand tightening on the handle of the cart. She tried to ignore them, pushing forward, but their words stopped her cold. "I heard she's been meeting someone. And her husband. He's in a wheelchair, isn't he? Such a shame." The milk slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a thud, spilling everywhere. The women gasped, their conversation silenced as Emma turned to face them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you have something you'd like to say to me directly?" They exchanged nervous glances, their courage faltering under her glare. "No, of course not," one of them stammered before quickly walking away. Emma knelt to pick up the carton, her face burning with shame and fury. She could feel the stares of other shoppers, their pity and judgment weighing heavily on her. That evening, David sat in the living room, his laptop open on the small table in front of him. He was reviewing the latest expenses when his phone buzzed. A message from a coworker lit up the screen. "Thought you should see this." He opened the link, his breath catching as he read the headline. "Local mother of one spotted with mystery man." Below it was a blurry photo of Emma and Marcus sitting together at the coffee shop. David's hands trembled, and his vision blurred as anger surged through him. He wheeled himself to the kitchen, where Emma was stirring a pot on the stove. "Care to explain this?" he demanded, holding out the phone. Emma turned, her eyes widening when she saw the screen. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" he snapped. "What the hell is going on, Emma? Who is this man?" "It's not what it looks like," she began, but David cut her off. "Don't lie to me." His voice cracked, the pain in it slicing through the air. "I've been sitting here trying to keep this family together, and this is what you've been doing?" Emma's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter. "It's not an affair, David. He's just a friend." "A friend?" David's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Then why are people whispering about us in the grocery store? Why is there a picture of you looking like you're on a date?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "You don't understand what it's like, David, to carry all of this by myself." David's voice softened, the anger giving way to despair. "You think I don't feel the weight of this? You think I don't see how much you're struggling? But instead of talking to me, you go to him?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," Emma said, her voice cracking. "I just needed someone to listen." "You had someone to listen," David replied, his voice breaking. "You had me." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma wiped at her tears, but they wouldn't stop. She turned away, her back to him, unable to face the heartbreak etched across his face. From the hallway, Sophie peeked around the corner, her small hands clutching the doorframe. She didn't say a word, but the tears streaming down her cheeks spoke volumes. David noticed her first, his expression softening. "Sophie." She ran to him, burying her face in his chest. "Why can't we just be happy again?" she sobbed. Emma turned, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter's anguish. She reached out, but Sophie flinched, clinging tighter to David. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. But sorry felt like too little, too late. The air was thick with tension as David waited in the living room, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The text from Marcus that he had found on Emma's phone played on a loop in his mind, each word stoking the fire of his anger and despair. When the front door opened, the sound echoed like a thunderclap. Emma stepped inside, her face pale and tired. She froze when she saw him waiting, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazing with emotion. "David," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't pretend this is just another night. We need to talk." Emma set her bag down slowly, her heart pounding. "I don't know what you think you found, but—" David rolled closer, his voice trembling. "I know everything, Emma. The messages, the meetings, the whispers at the store. I've had enough of your lies." Emma's chest tightened. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Because all I see is my wife sneaking around with another man while our daughter cries herself to sleep." Emma flinched, tears springing to her eyes. "I wasn't sneaking around. I was trying to cope. Do you know how hard it's been to hold everything together? And you think it's been easy for me?" David's voice cracked, raw and filled with anguish. "Do you think I wanted this? To feel like a burden every single day?" "You're not a burden," Emma whispered, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Then why, Emma?" he asked, his voice dropping. "Why did you turn to him instead of me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emma sank into the chair opposite him, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice muffled. "I felt lost. And Marcus, he listened. He made me feel like myself again, just for a little while." David's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "So you ran to him instead of fighting for us?" "It wasn't like that," Emma cried, her voice breaking. "I was trying to keep this family from falling apart, but I was drowning, David. And I didn't know how to tell you without breaking you too." David stared at her, his anger giving way to something deeper, pain, betrayal, and an overwhelming sadness. "You didn't break me, Emma. You just made me feel invisible." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them both. From the hallway, Sophie appeared, her eyes red and swollen. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you tearing us apart?" Emma turned, her breath catching at the sight of her daughter's anguish. "Sophie, honey? No!" Sophie shouted, her tears spilling over. "You're supposed to love each other. You're supposed to love me. Why does it feel like I'm the only one who cares anymore?" David wheeled himself toward her, his arms outstretched. "Come here, pumpkin." But Sophie stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't want hugs. I want my family back." Emma stood, her knees weak. "Sophie, please, just—" "You don't get it," Sophie screamed. "You're so busy being mad at each other that you don't even see what you're doing to me." Her words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt before Sophie, reaching out hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this to happen." David's voice was thick with emotion. "Neither did I." Sophie looked between them, her small frame trembling with the weight of emotions too big for her to bear. "Then fix it," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, just fix it." Emma and David exchanged a look, the depth of their shared pain mirrored in each other's eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, the walls between them began to crack, not from anger, but from the realization of what they were losing. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft orange glow. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand, staring at Marcus's name on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her chest tight with indecision. The fight with David, Sophie's heartbreaking plea, it all churned in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. Finally, she pressed the button. The line rang twice before Marcus's voice came through, warm and familiar. "Emma," he said, relief evident in his tone. "I was starting to think you'd never call." Her voice was quieter than she intended. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end. Is everything okay?" "No," she admitted, her throat tightening. "It's not." Later that evening, Emma parked her car outside a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. She spotted Marcus through the window, sitting in a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. He smiled, waving her over. She hesitated before stepping inside, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached, Marcus stood to greet her, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "You came," he said softly. Emma sat down, pulling her hand away. "Marcus, I need to understand. What is this?" His expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "What do you mean?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "What are we doing? I thought we were friends, but I don't know anymore." Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. "Emma, you deserve to be happy. I see the way David looks at you or doesn't look at you. You deserve someone who sees you, who makes you feel alive again." His words sent a chill down her spine. "And you think that someone is you?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. "It could be." Emma's breath hitched. "I'm married, Marcus. I have a family." "And are you happy?" he asked, his tone gentle but pointed. Her silence was answer enough. "You're not," Marcus said, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "I'm not saying leave him tomorrow, but you can't keep living like this, Emma. You deserve better." His words hung in the air, tempting and terrifying. For a moment she let herself imagine it. Life without the constant tension, without the crushing weight of responsibility. But then she thought of Sophie's tearful face, of David's quiet heartbreak, and guilt washed over her. "I need time," she said, pulling her hand away. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, David sat in his wheelchair by the window, the sunlight streaming across his face. His laptop was open on the small table beside him, but his eyes were fixed on Emma as she moved through the kitchen, a little too quickly, a little too carefully. "You were out late," he said, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. Emma froze for a split second before turning to face him. "I needed some air," she said, forcing a smile. "Alone?" David asked, his gaze piercing. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding. "Yes." David studied her for a moment before looking away, his jaw tightening. "Okay." But it wasn't okay, not for him and not for her. Later that day, while Emma was out running errands, David's phone buzzed on the counter. Sophie picked it up, her brow furrowing when she saw the message. "I can't wait to see you again." "Em?" Her heart sank, and she quickly put the phone back, her mind racing. When Emma returned home, Sophie confronted her, her small frame trembling with anger. "Who's Em?" Sophie demanded, her voice shaking. Emma's face paled. "What are you talking about?" "I saw the message, Mom!" Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. "Is it true? Are you cheating on Dad?" Emma's knees buckled and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "Sophie, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Sophie shouted, her voice cracking. "Tell me the truth, Mom. I deserve to know." Emma's tears flowed freely as she reached out for her daughter, but Sophie stepped back, her eyes filled with betrayal. "You're supposed to be the one holding us together," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "But you're the one tearing us apart." The silence in the house was suffocating. The air felt heavy as Emma sat alone in the living room, the dim light of the evening casting long shadows on the walls. She clutched her phone tightly in her hand, her thumb hovering over Marcus's number. But she couldn't bring herself to press call. David was in the den, the faint hum of his wheelchair rolling over the wooden floors, breaking the stillness every so often. Sophie had locked herself in her room hours ago, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Emma flinched, her heart pounding. She opened the door to find Marcus standing there, his expression tense but calm. "What are you doing here?" Emma whispered, glancing over her shoulder to see if David had heard. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low. "We need to talk. You've been distant, and I can't just sit around wondering where we stand." Emma stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't the time." When is it ever going to be the time, Emma? Marcus's frustration was evident. You're miserable. He's miserable. Why are you holding on to something that's already broken? Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. Because it's my family, Marcus. It's not that simple. The door creaked open, and they both turned to see David sitting in his wheelchair, his face pale but resolute. His voice was cold, cutting through the tension. So this is him. Emma's stomach dropped. David, save it, he interrupted, his eyes locked on Marcus. You got a lot of nerve showing up here. Marcus squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening. I'm here because I care about Emma, more than you ever did. David's laugh was bitter, hollow. You think you're her knight in shining armor? You're just a distraction, a way for her to escape the mess we've been trying to clean up. That's enough! Emma's voice cracked as she stepped between them. This isn't helping anyone. Helping? David's voice rose, trembling with anger. You think this is about help? I'm trying to hold this family together while you're out playing house with someone else. Sophie's voice rang out from behind them, sharp and trembling. Stop it! They all turned to see her standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Why do you always have to fight? Why can't you just fix it? Sophie, Emma started, but Sophie shook her head violently. No, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of pretending like everything's okay when it's not. Sophie's voice cracked, her small frame trembling with the weight of emotions too big for her. David wheeled himself closer, his anger giving way to pain. Sophie, we're trying. We're just trying. No, you're not. Sophie's voice broke into a sob. You're just tearing each other apart, and you don't even care what it's doing to me. Emma reached for her daughter, but Sophie pulled away, her voice a desperate whisper. You don't love each other anymore, do you? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emma's tears spilled over, and David looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't know, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophie's face crumpled, and she turned, running back into the house. Marcus looked at Emma, his expression conflicted. I didn't come here to make things worse, but maybe this is what it takes to finally make a decision. Get out, David said, his voice low and cold. Marcus hesitated, but Emma nodded, her eyes filled with tears. You should go. As Marcus walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night, Emma felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her like never before. She turned to David, her voice shaking. What are we going to do? David looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. We either fight for this or we let it die, but I can't keep doing this in between, Emma. Not anymore. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the living room where David sat in his wheelchair, staring out at the street. His thoughts were heavy, his heart weighed down by the events of the night before. The house was eerily quiet. Emma was in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes faint and mechanical. Sophie hadn't come out of her room since storming off. David ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his own helplessness. But then he heard it, a muffled sob. It came from the hallway. Slowly he wheeled himself toward the sound, his heart tightening with each turn of the wheels. As he reached Sophie's door, he knocked gently. Sophie? He called softly. It's Dad. Can I come in? There was a long pause and then a weak, okay. David pushed the door open to find Sophie curled up on her bed, her face buried in a pillow. Her small shoulders trembled with each sob, and the sight broke him. Hey, Pumpkin, he said gently, rolling closer. What's going on? She sat up, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. I hate this, Dad. I hate everything. Why can't things just go back to the way they were? David reached out, taking her small hand in his. I know, sweetheart. I wish I could fix it all for you. Why can't you? Sophie asked, her voice cracking. You're supposed to be strong, Dad. You're supposed to make everything better. David's throat tightened. I'm trying, Sophie, I really am. But sometimes even grown-ups don't have all the answers. Sophie's tears spilled over again, and she looked at him with eyes full of raw emotion. Do you still love Mom? The question hit David like a punch to the gut. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I love the family we've built, and I love you more than anything in the world. Your mom and I, we're just trying to figure things out. But what if you can't? Sophie whispered. David took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Then we'll still be a family. No matter what happens between me and your mom, you'll always have us. We'll never stop loving you." Sophie leaned forward, wrapping her arms around him. David held her tightly, his own tears finally escaping as he kissed the top of her head. "I'm sorry, Pumpkin," he whispered. "I'm sorry you have to go through this." Later that day, David found himself in the den, sorting through old photo albums. He smiled faintly at a picture of Sophie as a baby, her tiny hand gripping his finger. He turned the page to find a photo of him and Emma on their wedding day, their smiles full of hope and promise. Emma walked in quietly, her eyes falling on the album. She hesitated, then sat down across from him. "Looking back at the good times?" she asked softly. David nodded, trying to remember what it felt like to believe in forever. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "We've lost so much, haven't we?" David closed the album and met her gaze. "We still have Sophie, and we owe it to her to figure this out, whatever that looks like." Emma nodded, her voice trembling. "I want to fix this, David. I really do." "For her?" he asked, his tone neutral. "For all of us," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. David leaned back, letting out a long sigh. "Then let's start by being honest. No more secrets, Emma. No more lies." She nodded again, her resolve clear. No more lies. The weight between them didn't disappear, but for the first time in a long time it felt manageable. The night was heavy with silence, but Emma couldn't sleep. She lay on her side, staring at the shadows on the wall, her mind replaying every mistake, every hurtful word, every moment she had ignored the growing cracks in her family. Unable to bear the stillness any longer, she slipped out of bed and padded quietly to Sophie's room. She opened the door slightly, just enough to see her daughter's small frame curled up under the blankets. Her breathing was steady, but her face was turned toward the window, tear stains still visible on her cheeks. Emma's chest tightened, and tears welled up in her eyes. She stepped inside, careful not to wake Sophie, and sat on the edge of the bed. She reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You deserve better than this, better than me." Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mom?" Emma froze, her hand hovering mid-air. "I didn't mean to wake you, sweetie." Sophie sat up slightly, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" Emma tried to smile, but it faltered. I wanted to check on you, make sure you're okay." Sophie looked at her, her expression both curious and wary. "I'm fine, I guess. Why are you crying?" Emma shook her head, wiping her tears quickly. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and they hurt the people they love. I've made so many mistakes, Sophie, and I'm so sorry that you're the one paying for them." Sophie frowned, her voice small but firm. "You and Dad fight a lot. It's scary." Emma's heart broke at the simplicity of her daughter's words. "I know, honey, and we're trying to fix it. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, we both love you more than anything in the world." Sophie hesitated before reaching out and taking Emma's hand. "I don't want to lose you or Dad." Emma pulled her into a tight hug, her tears falling freely. "You won't, baby, I promise. We'll always be here for you." The next morning, Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The weight of Sophie's words lingered in her mind. David rolled into the room, his expression tired but softer than it had been in days. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," Emma replied, her voice subdued. He eyed her carefully before speaking. "Sophie talked to me earlier. She said you were with her last night." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I needed to apologize. She's been carrying so much, David. It's not fair." David sighed, his shoulders slumping. "No, it's not. But it's not all on you, Emma. I've made my share of mistakes, too." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I don't know how to undo the damage I've done. Every choice I've made has pushed us further apart." David rolled closer, his voice soft but steady. "Then maybe it's time we stop looking back and start figuring out how to move forward." Emma let out a shaky breath, a flicker of hope breaking through her despair. "Do you think we can? After everything?" David's gaze was unwavering. "For Sophie, we have to try." Later that day, Emma sat in the den with a box of old family photos. As she flipped through them, memories of happier times flooded her mind. Picnics at the park, Christmas mornings, Sophie's first day of school. One photo in particular caught her attention. It was of her and David, taken before Sophie was born. They were sitting on a blanket in the grass, laughing at something out of frame. The love and joy in their expressions were unmistakable. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the photo to her chest. "Where did we go so wrong?" she whispered. But as the tears fell, something inside her shifted. She couldn't change the past, but she could fight for the future. For Sophie, for David, for the family they had once been and could be again. The sun broke through the clouds as if signaling a fresh start. Emma sat at the dining table, a notebook and pen in hand, scribbling a list of things she needed to say. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. She couldn't run anymore. David wheeled himself into the room, his eyes immediately catching the intensity of her focus. "You're up early," he said, his voice cautious. Emma looked up, startled. "I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking a lot." David nodded, rolling closer. "About what?" Emma hesitated, then held up the notebook. "This. Everything I need to tell you, no matter how hard it is." David studied her for a moment before nodding. "Okay, let's hear it." Emma's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. I've lied to you, David. Not just about Marcus, but about how I've felt for years. I let resentment build up, and instead of talking to you, I shut you out." David's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his eyes fixed on hers. "And then when things got hard," Emma continued, her voice breaking, "I looked for comfort in all the wrong places. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And I'm so sorry, David. I'm sorry for everything I've put you and Sophie through." David exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping the arm of his wheelchair. "Do you still love him?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. "No," she said firmly. "What I thought was love. It wasn't real. It was just an escape. But I don't want to escape anymore. I want to fix this. Us, if you'll let me." David leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Fixing this isn't going to be easy, Emma. You know that, right?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. For you, for Sophie, for us." Later that day, Emma stood in front of the bathroom mirror, taking a long, hard look at herself. The woman staring back at her seemed like a stranger, worn down by guilt and regret, but also brimming with determination. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice cautious. "Emma? It's over, Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ending this. I can't keep living this way." There was a long silence on the other end before Marcus spoke. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma, or your family." "I know," Emma replied, "but this was never right. I need to focus on my family now. Goodbye, Marcus." She hung up before he could respond, her chest heaving with the weight of her decision. That evening, Emma found Sophie in the backyard, sitting on the swing set. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard. Emma walked over and sat on the swing beside her. "Hey, kiddo," Emma said softly. Sophie looked up, her expression guarded. "Hey," Emma took a deep breath. "I ended it. With Marcus." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really?" Emma nodded. "Really, I made a lot of mistakes, Sophie. But I want to be better. For you and for your dad. You both deserve better." Sophie stared at her for a long moment before leaning over and wrapping her arms around Emma. "I just want us to be a family again." Emma hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The auditorium buzzed with the excited chatter of parents and students as everyone settled into their seats. The stage, adorned with handmade props and colorful backdrops, stood as a testament to weeks of preparation. David wheeled himself to the center aisle, Emma walking beside him with a program clutched tightly in her hands. Sophie had been rehearsing her lines every night for weeks, and now the moment had arrived. The school play wasn't just a performance. It was her chance to shine amidst the shadows that had loomed over their family. Emma adjusted David's blanket, a nervous habit she had picked up during moments of stillness. "She's going to do great," she said, her voice trembling slightly. David nodded, his gaze fixed on the stage. "She always does." As the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the room. The first notes of music played softly, signaling the start of the play. Sophie appeared on stage, her costume a perfect blend of whimsy and elegance. She looked out into the audience, her eyes scanning the sea of faces until they landed on her parents. A small, confident smile spread across her face. David felt his chest tighten as pride swelled within him. "That's my girl," he whispered. Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. The play unfolded beautifully, each scene drawing the audience deeper into its world. Sophie's voice carried through the auditorium, clear and full of emotion. She commanded the stage with a confidence that surprised even her parents. But it was during the final act that Sophie's performance transcended the script. Her character's monologue was about forgiveness and the strength it takes to rebuild trust. "I've learned that love isn't about perfection," Sophie recited, her voice trembling. "It's about standing by each other, even when things fall apart. It's about choosing to stay, to fight, to believe in something bigger than the mistakes we've made." Emma's breath hitched, and she covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. David leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding. He wasn't just watching Sophie's character speak, he was hearing his daughter's heart. As Sophie delivered the final line, her eyes once again found her parents. "Because at the end of the day, family is worth fighting for." The audience erupted into applause, but Emma and David sat frozen, overcome by the weight of Sophie's words. After the play, the hallway outside the auditorium was packed with proud parents and excited children. Sophie ran up to her parents, her face flushed with happiness. "Did you like it?" she asked breathlessly. Emma knelt down, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. "You were amazing, sweetheart. Absolutely amazing." David reached out, taking Sophie's hand. "You made us so proud tonight, not just because of your performance, but because of the heart you put into it." Sophie's eyes sparkled as she looked between her parents. I wanted you to know how much I love you. Both of you." Emma's tears fell freely as she hugged Sophie again. "We love you too, baby. More than you'll ever know." Later that evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the warmth of the moment lingered. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting on Emma's lap. David broke the silence. "I think tonight was a reminder of what really matters." Emma nodded, her fingers gently brushing through Sophie's hair. "She's been our anchor through all of this. We owe it to her to keep fighting." David looked at Emma, his expression softening. "And to each other. For better or worse, Emma. That's what we promised, right?" Emma met his gaze, a mixture of hope and vulnerability in her eyes. "Right." As the clock ticked quietly, the family stayed there, wrapped in a fragile but undeniable sense of unity. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood as Emma stood by the front window, holding a mug of steaming coffee. She watched Sophie on the porch, carefully tying the laces of her sneakers before grabbing her backpack. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie's smile was unburdened, free. Emma's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. Today marked a new beginning, not just for Sophie, but for all of them. David rolled into the room, his expression calm but observant. "Big day for her," he said, nodding toward the porch. Emma turned to face him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Big day for all of us." David tilted his head, his eyes searching hers. "You seem lighter." Emma nodded, placing the mug on the windowsill. "Because for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm not carrying everything alone." David reached out, his hand brushing hers. "You never had to, Emma. I just didn't know how to remind you of that." Their hands lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the distance they had traveled to reach this point. Later that afternoon, Emma and Sophie spent time packing boxes in Sophie's room. "What do you think about this?" Sophie asked, holding up a photo of the three of them at a beach years ago. Emma smiled, taking the photo from her daughter. "I think it belongs on your desk at the new house." Sophie nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It was a good day, wasn't it?" "It was," Emma agreed, her voice warm. "And there are going to be a lot more good days ahead. You'll see." Sophie looked at her mother, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I believe you." That evening, the three of them sat around the dining table, sharing a simple but hearty dinner. Laughter filled the air as Sophie recounted a funny story from school, her animated gestures making even David chuckle. As the plates were cleared and dessert was served, David leaned forward slightly. "There's something I want to say." Emma and Sophie both turned their attention to him, their curiosity piqued. "I know this hasn't been easy for any of us, but tonight, sitting here together, I feel like we've started to find our way back to what really matters, and I'm proud of us, for fighting, for trying, and for not giving up on each other." Emma's eyes glistened as she reached for his hand. "I'm proud of us too." Sophie grinned, raising her glass of milk. "To us." David and Emma laughed softly, clinking their glasses with hers. As the house quieted down for the night, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. Her finger hovered over Marcus's name for a moment before she deleted his contact entirely. She exhaled deeply, setting the phone down and turning off the light. Sliding under the covers, she turned toward David, who was already half asleep. "David?" He murmured. "Thank you for not giving up on me." He opened his eyes slightly, his gaze steady. "We're a team, Emma. Always." In the stillness of the night, Emma finally allowed herself to believe it. The house echoed with the soft hum of activity as the morning sun filtered through the windows. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, labeled with Sophie's careful handwriting. The air carried a mix of anticipation and bittersweet memories. David sat in the kitchen, his coffee untouched, as he gazed out at the backyard. It was the same view he had looked at for years, but today it felt different, like a chapter closing. Emma walked in, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee delivery," she said with a small smile, setting one in front of him. David looked up, a warmth in his eyes. "Thanks." He gestured toward the backyard. "I was just thinking about all the times Sophie played out there. It feels strange to say goodbye." Emma nodded, taking a seat across from him. "It does, but maybe it's not goodbye, it's making room for something new." David chuckled softly. "You've become the optimist of the family." "Someone had to," Emma replied, her smile growing. Sophie burst into the room, her energy infectious. "The movers are here." Emma and David exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "All right," David said, wheeling himself toward the living room. "Let's get this show on the road." The movers worked quickly, their efficiency turning the once cluttered home into a blank slate. Sophie darted around, directing traffic and ensuring her boxes were handled with care. At one point, she paused and looked at her parents. "Do you think we'll be happy in the new place?" Emma crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "Happiness doesn't come from where we live, sweetheart. It comes from us, from how we choose to live together." David nodded in agreement. "And I think we're ready to choose happiness again." Sophie's face lit up, and she threw her arms around both of them. The drive to the new house was filled with a quiet anticipation. As they turned onto the tree-lined street, the sight of their new home brought a collective gasp. It was smaller, cozier, but it radiated warmth and possibility. Sophie was the first to dart inside, her laughter echoing through the empty rooms. Emma followed, her fingers brushing against the freshly painted walls. "It feels good," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. David rolled in, his eyes scanning the space. "It feels like a fresh start." They spent the rest of the day unpacking, each box revealing pieces of their life that they carefully placed into the new space. Sophie insisted on setting up her room first, and by evening, she had turned it into her sanctuary. As the sun set, the family gathered on the back porch, a small space that overlooked a patch of wildflowers. Sophie broke the silence. "Do you think we'll plant a garden here?" Emma smiled. "I think we will. A garden, a swing set, maybe even some bird feeders." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening. "It's funny. I thought this would feel like an ending. But sitting here with you two, it feels like the beginning of something better." Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's because it is." Later that night, as Sophie slept peacefully in her new room, Emma and David sat together in the living room, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. "I was scared," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David turned to her. "Of what?" "Of losing everything, of not being able to fix what I broke." She looked down, her hands twisting nervously. "But you never stopped fighting for us, even when I didn't deserve it." David's voice was steady, filled with quiet resolve. "We both made mistakes, Emma. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up together." Emma felt tears welling up, but this time they weren't from pain. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the weight of their shared journey settle between them. For the first time in a long time, the silence was comforting. It spoke of resilience, forgiveness, and the undeniable bond that had weathered the storm. As the clock ticked past midnight, the house seemed to breathe with them, alive with the promise of a new beginning.